The whole town laughed at him, until his dog uncovered the secret that changed everything. Grant Holloway thought he was buying nothing more than a broken $1 shack on the edge of Pine Ridge. But the night his loyal dog Shadow scratched through the floorboards, the truth buried beneath that tiny house tore open a mystery no one in town was ready to face. Stay close. This story only gets deeper from here. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The rain came down in thin, cold needles, the kind that slipped past the collar and crawled along the skin like icy fingers. Grant Holloway stood on the side of the gravel road, his boots sinking into the mud of Pine Ridge, Montana. The clouds hung low over the dark pines, swallowing the last bit of daylight. Beside him, Shadow stood quietly. His black and tan coat was soaked, but his posture remained steady, alert, and loyal. The dog didn't flinch, even when thunder rolled across the mountains like distant artillery. He'd heard worse in another life. Grant pulled the hood of his worn jacket tighter around his neck. His hands trembled, partly from the cold, partly from the exhaustion that had clung to him for months. The past year had stripped him to the bone. His last mission, the one that cost him half his platoon, had also taken his sense of direction. His marriage dissolved under the weight of too many nightmares. Too many days when he couldn't leave his room. Too many nights when he woke screaming the names of men who would never answer again. By the time he returned to the States, he had nothing left but an honorable discharge, a duffel bag, and the dog who refused to leave his side. Shadow nudged his knee softly, urging him forward as the small wooden house came into view. It stood crooked at the end of the dirt lane, no bigger than a tool shed. The roof sagged, the chimney leaned like it had given up years ago, and the porch was one good wind away from collapsing. The door hung slightly open, not out of welcome, but because the hinges had rusted nearly through. This was the place he had traveled across half the state to see, a $1 property listed by the county after years of abandonment and unpaid taxes. Grant didn't know why the listing had caught his eye. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was simply that when a man has hit rock bottom, even a splintered plank of wood feels like a lifeline. He stepped closer, rain drumming against the hood of his jacket. A truck drove by on the road behind him, its headlights sweeping across the tiny house and then across Grant himself. It slowed. He heard the muffled laughter inside. "Hey, Holloway," a voice yelled through the window. "Replacing the dumpster behind the bar with a new home? Looks about the right size." Laughter exploded before the truck sped off again, spraying muddy water onto Grant's jeans. He didn't react, not outwardly. He never did. But inside, something twisted. A familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he got when he walked into a crowded supermarket or heard a door slam too loudly. People didn't understand men like him. They whispered. They judged. They didn't see what Shadow saw. The way Grant's hands shook when he tried to sign paperwork. The way his breath shortened when someone stood behind him too long. Shadow growled low, sensing tension, and pressed himself against Grant's leg, as if forming a shield. "It's all right, boy," Grant whispered. His voice was rough from months of silence. "Let's just get out of the rain." He walked toward the house. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, and one nearly snapped. The door resisted for a moment, then scraped open, revealing a single, windowless room no bigger than a storage closet. Dust floated in the air like ghostly snowflakes. The boards on the floor looked waterlogged and smelled faintly of rot. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling on a frayed cord, swaying slightly as if unsettled by a breeze that didn't exist. It wasn't much. Truthfully, it was nothing at all. But for the first time in months, Grant wasn't sleeping in the back of his truck or on a cot at the shelter in Billings. He wasn't waiting for a caseworker to return his calls. He wasn't being treated like a burden. He dropped his duffel bag to the floor, and the sound echoed through the empty space. Shadow circled the room, sniffing walls, corners, floor seams, alert, focused, maybe already sensing what Grant couldn't. Grant closed the door, shut out the storm, and leaned his forehead against the wood. The sound of the rain outside softened into a distant hush. He drew in a shaky breath and told himself he could rebuild this place. He could patch the leaks, replace the windows, maybe even fix the roof. He had survived worse than a collapsing house. He could do this. But as he turned around to face the dim, lonely room, he heard something. A faint metallic echo beneath the floorboards, a sound too deliberate, too sharp to be the settling of an old building. Shadow froze, His ears perked, his tail stiffened. Grant swallowed hard. The house was tiny. The house was abandoned. And yet it felt like something inside it had just awakened. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he said it for Shadow or for himself. Outside, thunder rumbled across the ridge. Inside, the air felt different, charged, electric, almost watching. The $1 house was not what it seemed. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped out of the rain and into that broken doorway, his life had already begun to shift, and Shadow had been the first to sense it. "Tomorrow," Grant murmured, sinking down onto the floor beside his dog. "We start over." Shadow curled against him, warm and steady, as the storm continued outside. Grant closed his eyes, but the house did not sleep. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Pine Ridge draped in a thin layer of fog that curled low over the ground like breath from something ancient. Grant pushed the swollen front door open and stepped outside, Shadow following close behind. The cold morning air carried the scent of wet pine and damp earth, a smell he once associated with early patrols in the mountains overseas. For a brief second, he stood still, letting the quiet settle over him, until Shadow nudged his hand, reminding him they weren't alone in this place. The tiny house sat at the edge of town, where paved roads surrendered to gravel and the forest pressed in from all sides. Behind the house stretched a line of abandoned sheds and rusted farm equipment swallowed by weeds. Ahead, the main street shimmered faintly through the haze. Grant didn't feel ready to face anyone, but he needed supplies, food for Shadow, nails for the loose boards, maybe a tarp for the leaking roof. Just the basics to make the place livable. He hadn't taken 10 steps toward the road when the first voice cut through the morning air. "Well, look who made it through the night." Grant stopped. Earl Mathers leaned against the hood of his truck across the street, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from loud opinions and cheap beer. He was wiping down a hunting rifle, an act meant to intimidate even though the safety was still on. "Thought that shack would fall on your head?" Earl continued with a grin. "Guess even rotten wood knows better than to touch a crazy Marine." Grant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence only encouraged Earl. "You hear anything last night? Ghosts? Rats? Voices in your head?" Earl tapped his temple dramatically. "Careful now. Folks say guys like you don't do well alone." Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between Grant and Earl. Hackles raised just slightly, not enough to be threatening, but enough to warn. Earl scoffed. "That mutt going to save you? Please." Grant felt his heart rate spike. Noise, laughter, taunting, always did that. It took him back instantly, back to dusty alleys and collapsing buildings, back to the weight of men he'd dragged to safety, only to hold their hands while they faded away. Shadow sensed it too, leaning against him, grounding him. Grant took a slow breath. "Come on, boy," he muttered, turning away before his pulse could win the fight against reason. He hadn't walked far before he caught people staring. A woman trimming hedges whispered something to her neighbor. A man on the porch took a photo. 2 teenagers snickered loudly as they passed. One whispering, "Dude bought a dollhouse." The other added, "For $1, I guess that's still too expensive." Even the cashier at the small-town hardware store, a gray-haired man with a faded American flag on his cap, paused midway through ringing up Grant's purchases. "You really buy that dump?" he asked, as though the idea insulted him personally. Grant kept his voice even. "Yeah." The cashier whistled under his breath. "You're braver than me, or crazier. Folks say it's haunted. Others say it's ready to collapse. Either way, it ain't for someone looking to live long." Grant offered a tight nod, grabbed his supplies, and walked out before the conversation could dig deeper under his skin. The return walk to the tiny house felt longer than before. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the peeling paint and sagging roof in full daylight, making the structure look even smaller than Grant remembered. Calling it a house felt generous. It was a box, 1 room, uneven beams, barely a foundation. Still, Shadow trotted toward it like it was a fortress. Grant stepped inside and set the supplies down. The air smelled of old wood and rain-soaked insulation. When the door shut, an unsettling quiet wrapped around them. It wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. The type of silence that made every tick of settling lumber sound like a whisper. Shadow began pacing the room again, nose pressed low to the floor, tail stiff. Every few seconds he'd pause over the same plank near the corner, the one that had echoed strangely the night before. Grant watched him closely, that same uneasy feeling rising like a chill along his spine. "Still on that spot, huh?" he murmured. Shadow pressed his paw against the floor. A soft thud, metallic, answered. Grant's stomach dropped. He knelt beside Shadow and ran his hand along the board. It was colder than the rest. Not damp, cold, as if something beneath it held its own temperature. He tapped it lightly. The sound didn't match the rest of the floor. Instead of the dull knock of wood, it rang faintly, sharp and hollow. He recoiled slightly. Shadow's ears pointed forward, alert, his breathing low and measured. The dog wasn't just curious, he was guarding. Grant sat back against the wall, listening. The house creaked. Wind brushed against the siding. Somewhere inside the walls, something shifted. Not loud, just enough to make the hairs on his arms rise. Years of combat had taught him one truth. Silence could be warning. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" Grant whispered. Shadow came to his side and rested his head under Grant's hand, grounding him again. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by laughter drifting from the road. More people stopping to stare. More judgment. More noise he couldn't control. But inside this house, something else waited. Something deeper than mockery. Something hidden. And Shadow, for reasons Grant didn't yet understand, had already found the first piece of it. Grant tightened his grip on the dog's fur, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. "Whatever's down there," he murmured, "we'll figure it out, one step at a time." Shadow didn't blink. The house didn't creak. For a moment, even the world outside seemed to pause. And in that stillness, Grant felt the truth pressing in on him from all sides. This tiny broken house had secrets, and it wasn't done revealing them. By the time dusk settled over Pine Ridge, the fog had thinned, and the sky stretched out in a bruised purple. Grant stood outside, splitting kindling for the tiny stove, the repeated swing of the axe steadying his nerves. The rhythm helped quiet the noise in his mind, the echoes of jeers from town, the memory of Earl's voice mocking him, the shame that returned each time someone looked at him like he was damaged beyond repair. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching him with sharp, unblinking focus. The dog's ears twitched at even the smallest sound. He had always been that way, even during deployments. Nervous energy before a raid, stillness before danger. Grant trusted that instinct more than he trusted his own. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, they went inside. The last bit of daylight filtered through the crooked window, making the dust float like faint snow. The house was too quiet again. So quiet that Grant could hear his own heartbeat thudding faintly in his ears. He crouched beside the small stove to light the fire when Shadow suddenly stiffened. The dog's head snapped toward that same corner board, the one with the hollow sound. A low rumble rose deep from his chest, the kind he used only when something truly didn't belong. Grant froze, the match burning down between his fingers. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Shadow stepped forward, his body low but powerful, tail straight, eyes locked on the floorboard. Then he pawed it, hard. The board shifted just enough to answer with a soft metallic clink. Grant's stomach tightened. He knelt beside Shadow and pressed his palm to the wood. It was colder than the surrounding floor, not with the wet chill of the room, but with the deep, dry cold of metal hidden underneath. He tapped once. The sound rang back sharp and hollow. A memory flashed through him. A concealed hatch in Kandahar, steel moving beneath a rug, the click that came a heartbeat before danger. Grant jerked his hand away. Shadow nudged his wrist. "Okay," Grant whispered, forcing the memory to loosen its grip. "I'm here." He brushed away years of dirt and found a thin seam around the plank. The board had not been nailed down like the others. With Shadow watching, Grant lifted one edge. Beneath it lay a smooth steel plate stamped with a faded serial number. Grant stared at it. What on earth? He tried to pry the plate up, first with his fingers, then with the claw of his hammer. It did not move. The steel seemed fixed into a larger mechanism buried beneath the floor. When he shone his flashlight along the edge, the beam caught a second seam disappearing under the neighboring boards. This was not a root cellar cover. It was part of something engineered. Then came a faint click from below. Shadow stiffened. His ears snapped forward. Grant held still, listening. The sound did not repeat, but the house suddenly felt smaller around him. Outside, wind brushed the siding. Inside, Shadow kept his nose close to the hidden steel, alert to something Grant could not yet reach. Grant lowered the loose plank back into place. "Whatever's under there," he murmured, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. "We don't force it tonight. We figure out how it opens." Shadow did not look away from the corner. For years, Grant had been haunted by things locked inside his own memory. Now, for the first time, there was a mystery beneath his feet, physical, deliberate, and real. He had found only a piece of it, but that was enough to keep sleep far away. By morning, Grant hadn't slept more than a couple of hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined that faint mechanical click beneath the floor repeating in the dark. Half memory and half fear. Shadow stayed awake beside him until dawn, ears twitching at every creak the old boards made. When sunlight finally spilled across the crooked window, Grant forced himself to stand. He needed air, space, something to push the tension out of his chest. But the moment he stepped outside, he realized the town wasn't going to give him peace. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the narrow road. Two men stood in the truck bed, pointing phones at him. The one in the passenger seat laughed, saying loudly enough for anyone to hear, "There he is, the Dollar House Marine. Bet that shack collapses before lunch." Laughter trailed behind the truck as it continued down the hill. Grant clenched his jaw, fighting the familiar tightening behind his ribs. Shadow stood in front of him, a living wall between Grant and the world, growling low, not threatening, but warning. "Easy," Grant murmured. But Shadow didn't relax. The dog was reading more than just strangers' voices. He always did. Grant gathered his tools from the porch, hammer, nails, the tarp he bought yesterday, and started patching the broken shingles on the roof. Anything to stay busy, anything to stay out of his own head. But Pine Ridge wasn't done with him. Sometime after noon, when the sun was just beginning to warm the damp air, he heard footsteps crunching across the gravel. He turned to see Earl Mathers, the same man who mocked him the day before, standing with his arms folded, a smirk spread across his face. "Well, look at this," Earl said. "The Marine thinks he's Bob the Builder." Grant didn't answer. He continued hammering, each strike echoing through the quiet ridge like a heartbeat. Earl stepped closer. "Listen, Holloway. Folks around here don't take kindly to strangers buying up property, especially ones with problems." Grant froze mid-swing. "I don't want trouble." "You don't have to want it," Earl replied, shrugging. "Trouble finds your kind." Shadow trotted between them, posture stiff, head low, teeth just barely visible. Earl scoffed and stepped back. "Control your animal. Last thing we need is some PTSD case letting his dog loose." Grant's grip tightened around the hammer. His pulse began to rise. First, the mocking. Then, the accusations. Then, the word he hated the most, PTSD, thrown around like a curse. "I said I don't want trouble," Grant repeated, voice lower. "And I'm saying you're bringing it," Earl shot back. "This house, it's a joke. Everyone's laughing at you." Then, leaning in, "You should have stayed with your own kind, in whatever hole they pulled you out of." Grant felt the world tilt, his vision narrowing, the mountains around him dissolving into the dust of another country. For a moment, he wasn't in Pine Ridge. He was back in a narrow alley, sand whipping into his eyes, radio static in his ear, Shadow barking because an explosion had just gone off 50 yards away. His breath shortened, his hands shook. Shadow nudged him sharply, once, twice, pulling him back. Grant blinked hard, and the world settled again. Earl watched him with an expression between curiosity and disgust. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought." Grant didn't respond. He stepped off the ladder, walked toward the door, and Shadow followed close on his heels. But just as Grant reached for the knob, a sheriff's cruiser rumbled up the hill. Sheriff Boone stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a tall man with a clipped mustache and eyes that held little patience. "Holloway," Boone said without greeting. "I've been hearing complaints." Grant exhaled slowly. "About what?" "Noise, debris, people saying you're acting suspicious." Boone lifted a brow. "You're new here, folks are nervous." "Nervous about what?" Grant asked. About you, Boone said plainly. A man with your background. Your record says you've got a history of episodes. Grant swallowed hard. I'm not a threat. We'll see, the sheriff replied. For now, keep it quiet. Don't give folks a reason to call me again. Shadow growled, not loud, but unmistakable. Boone pointed at the dog. You keep him on a leash. Grant stepped in front of Shadow. He's trained. He's never hurt anyone. Yet, Boone said, then turned to leave. Remember what I said. The cruiser rolled off, leaving dust and tension in its wake. Grant stood there for several seconds, shoulders tight, breath trapped in his throat. He had come here to disappear, to heal, to start over. But Pine Ridge wasn't giving him a chance. They saw him not as a man trying to rebuild, but as a broken piece of machinery, unpredictable, unwanted. He finally stepped inside the house and shut the door. Shadow pressed against him, sensing the pressure inside his chest. Come here, boy, Grant whispered, kneeling down. Shadow rested his head against Grant's shoulder, grounding him with steady warmth. But before Grant could fully catch his breath, a sound came from beneath the floor, soft, sharp, like a mechanism snapping back into place. Grant froze. Shadow lifted his head, ears pointed straight at the corner where the steel plate lay hidden beneath the loose plank. Then the dog padded toward it and sat down, staring at the floor as though he knew something Grant did not. Not now, Grant whispered, rubbing his temples. I can't handle this right now. But the house didn't care. Another faint noise came from beneath the floor, something shifting inside the hidden mechanism. Grant's heartbeat picked up again. Outside, Earl's voice drifted through the thin walls as he talked loudly to someone down the hill. Told you, that guy's trouble. And that house ain't right either. Pressure from the town. Pressure from the past. Pressure from the house itself. It all tightened around Grant like a slow-building storm. And Shadow, loyal and unshakable, stood guard over the hidden corner, refusing to let Grant dismiss what they had found. Grant tried to distract himself by straightening the room, sweeping sawdust, tightening loose hinges on the warped doorframe. But the more he tried to focus on the surface, the more the house insisted on pulling him back toward the dark beneath it. Shadow wouldn't leave the corner of the floor. Every few minutes, Grant heard the dog's claws tap against the wood, slow at first, then more frantic. Scratch, 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 a low whine. Then the dog pressed his nose against the adjoining plank, tail stiff, body tense. Shadow, Grant muttered, setting his tools down. What are you trying to tell me? The dog didn't turn. Instead, he pawed harder, claws raking against the wood until one nail caught, and he yelped in pain. Grant's heart lurched. Hey. Easy. Easy, boy. He knelt beside him, lifting Shadow's paw gently. A small bead of red dotted the fur around one nail. Nothing serious, but enough to send a wave of guilt crashing over him. You're hurt because I didn't listen, Grant whispered. Shadow pressed his head into Grant's shoulder as if insisting, listen now. Grant inhaled deeply, forcing his pulse to settle. Then he touched the floor where Shadow had been scratching. At first, it felt like any old plank. Rough, cold, swollen from years of moisture. But as he brushed away dust, he noticed something strange. The grain of the wood didn't line up with the adjoining boards. It was subtle, invisible unless you were searching for it. But now Grant saw it. A thin, straight seam, too perfect to be natural. Grant's throat tightened. This was not ordinary flooring. It was a disguised release panel. He pressed his palm along the line. Nothing. Then he pressed again, harder. Toward the far edge. A soft click sounded beneath his hand. Shadow's ears shot up. The board shifted sideways, not up, sliding barely half an inch. Dust puffed into the air, revealing a razor-thin gap where there shouldn't be one. Grant instinctively stepped back. What in God's name? Shadow nudged the board again with his nose, insistent. Grant swallowed, placed both hands on the plank, and pushed. This time the panel didn't resist. It glided smoothly, like it was designed to be moved. A long, slow sound filled the room, wood against hidden metal rails. Then came the moment Grant would remember for the rest of his life. The board slid open. Beneath it wasn't dirt, wasn't foundation, wasn't anything a $1 abandoned tiny house should ever have. Instead, a narrow opening stretched downward into darkness, the air cold and stale rising from below like a forgotten breath. Grant froze, breath caught in his chest. Shadow leaned forward, ears forward, tail hovering, not wagging, not tucked, alert, ready. Narrow metal steps descended along one wall of the shaft, steep but solid, like a service stair built into the house. Grant whispered, "This isn't possible." He felt the world tilt again. Not with PTSD this time, but with something stranger. There's a whole room under this place. He grabbed his flashlight from the table. His hands trembled as he clicked it on. The beam cut through dust motes drifting like slow snowflakes into the narrow shaft. The metal steps disappeared into darkness, but the space below, whatever it was, felt massive, like a hollow stomach beneath the house. Grant felt the fear stir in his gut, but another feeling rose with it, curiosity. Shadow took a step closer to the opening, staring down as if he'd known this was here all along. "You found it," Grant murmured. "You knew before I did." Shadow pressed his shoulder gently against Grant's side, a grounding gesture, a reminder. They'd walked into darkness together before. They'd survived worse. And whatever was down there, they would face it the same way. Grant knelt at the edge of the opening. "Stay close," he whispered. He placed a foot on the first metal step. The steel felt cold even through his boot. He tested it. Solid. Shadow let out a short, low bark, a signal they'd practiced in the field, a warning. "I'm here. I'm ready." Grant nodded and descended slowly. Step by step. The shaft grew darker with each step. Shadows thickened. The air temperature dropped sharply, prickling goosebumps across his arms. Above him, Shadow paced anxiously at the opening, whining but waiting for Grant's signal. "I'll be right back," Grant called softly. His voice echoed slightly. That echo told him something important. This wasn't a crawl space. This wasn't a root cellar. The chamber below was large, too large. Finally, his boots hit solid ground. He steadied himself and lifted the flashlight. What he saw made his breath catch. Metal walls, bolts, rivets, sealed panels, a room at least twice the size of the house above. Grant turned slowly, sweeping the beam across the chamber. Dust coated everything in a thin gray layer, but beneath it, everything was intact, preserved. "This is impossible." Shadow barked sharply from above. The sound echoed deep, bouncing off walls, confirming the chamber's size. Grant called up, "It's okay, boy, just hold on." But Grant himself didn't believe his own reassurance, because right in front of him, illuminated by the shaky beam of his flashlight, sat a small metal table. And on it, a dusty laminated ID card. He stepped closer, brushing away the dust. The name hit him like a punch. Captain Doyle, U.S. Marine Corps. Status: missing in action. Grant staggered back a step. His throat tightened. His hands shook uncontrollably. Captain Doyle, his commander, the man he'd watched disappear during their final mission, the ghost who haunted every nightmare. "What were you doing here?" Grant whispered. Above him, Shadow barked again, louder this time. Grant looked back toward the stairwell. Something else was down here, something the house had been hiding for a very long time. And now, because of Shadow, the secret was awake. Grant stood there in the cold metal chamber, his breath fogging in the beam of his flashlight, his heart pounding like it wanted to burst from his chest. The ID card in his shaking hand felt impossibly heavy, like it carried the weight of the entire past he had spent years trying not to relive. Captain Doyle, missing in action, and somehow, here. Grant forced himself to look away from the card, scanning the room again. The chamber wasn't thrown together or makeshift. The walls were reinforced steel, lined with faintly glowing seams that hinted at old wiring. There were shelves bolted into place, each filled with neatly labeled folders, their edges yellowed by time. A metal desk sat in the far corner, half buried under dust and forgotten equipment. Above, Shadow barked again, sharper this time, as if urging him to move, to understand, to wake up. "I'm all right," Grant whispered up toward the opening. "Just hold tight." The words echoed back to him, distorted, reminding him of command briefings in underground bases, of missions that started in low-lit bunkers with too much quiet and too little certainty. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, grounding himself. He took a deep breath and forced himself forward. The desk was the first thing he approached. On top lay a handheld radio, from another era, but clean, like someone had used it not too long before abandoning it here. The dials were stiff, but intact. Next to it sat a small box stamped with a faded military insignia. He opened it slowly. Inside were a few dog tags, a folded map, and a stack of old cassette tapes. He lifted one, squinting through the dust. Operation Haven 6, he read aloud. The room felt instantly colder. He set the tape down with a shaky exhale, then unfurled the map. Lines of red ink darted across forest boundaries, water systems, old military training sites. Some crossed out, some circled, some linked to coordinates he didn't recognize. Captain Doyle had been investigating something, and he had been hiding here. Grant swallowed hard and looked around again. His flashlight beam landed on a metal locker across the room. The door hung slightly ajar. He took one step, then another, his boots echoing against the steel floor. Shadow barked again from above, 2 short bursts, alert. Grant froze. "What is it, boy?" No response except for a faint whine. "All right," he whispered. "I'm coming back up soon." He touched the locker door and gently pulled it open. It screeched softly. Inside hung a single torn military field jacket, caked in dust, but still bearing the name Doyle on the patch. Beneath it lay a stack of notebooks and a sealed envelope addressed only with one word, truth. Grant reached for it with trembling fingers. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of fear and desperate hope. Answers. That was all he ever wanted. Why Doyle vanished. Why half his unit never made it home. Why the mission that destroyed his life had never been explained. He was about to slide a finger under the seal when a loud thump rattled the shaft above. Grant jerked his head up. Shadow? Another thump. This one sharper. Metal on wood. Then Shadow growled. A deep, dangerous growl that Grant had only heard in combat zones. The kind that meant someone was near. Someone who shouldn't be. Grant shoved the envelope into his pocket and hurried toward the stairwell. "I'm coming, boy. I'm coming." He climbed fast, taking the metal steps 2 at a time. Heart thundering. The air grew warmer as he neared the top. Shadow's growl grew louder, angrier. Grant's head emerged through the opening, and there, at the far side of the tiny house, he saw it. The front door latch, trembling, not from wind, not from settling wood. Someone outside was testing it. Grant froze. Shadow positioned himself between Grant and the door. Teeth bared. Hackles raised. A silent shield standing against the unknown. Grant whispered, "Easy. Stay with me." The latch clicked again, slow and deliberate. Someone wanted in, but when they realized the door wouldn't move, the sound stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating. Grant waited. Every muscle tight, ears straining. Then came heavy footsteps moving away from the house. Slow, measured. Leaving the porch, Grant crawled the rest of the way onto the floor and closed the hidden panel, sliding it back into place with a soft thud. No one outside would ever know it was there. Shadow stood rigid, staring at the door as the last trace of footsteps faded into the night. Grant knelt beside him and placed a steadying hand on his back. Shadow did not relax, not even a little. "That wasn't a neighbor," Grant murmured. He knew it. Shadow knew it. Someone had come to the house, after dark, silently, and tried the door. This tiny cabin wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. And whatever lay beneath it, someone else wanted it back. Grant looked toward the sealed opening beneath the rug, then toward the door, then toward Shadow. The past wasn't behind him anymore. It had just climbed onto his porch, and it had knocked. Grant stayed completely still, one hand gripping Shadow's collar, the other pressed against the floor to steady himself. The tiny house felt too quiet now, like the walls themselves were listening. Outside, the footsteps had faded, but the tension they left behind hung thick in the air. Shadow's growl finally tapered off, but his body stayed rigid. gaze locked on the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. Grant swallowed hard. "All right, boy. We're going back down." Shadow flicked his ears, but he did not move until Grant slid the hidden panel open again. Grant descended first, then called Shadow down. The dog followed carefully along the steep metal steps and reached the chamber without hesitation. The underground room felt colder now, less like a discovery and more like a threat waiting to take shape. Grant moved to the metal desk and picked up the old radio, heavy, outdated, yet suspiciously well-maintained. Next to it sat the stack of cassette tapes. His fingers hovered over them until he found the one marked with a strip of worn label. Doyle final entry. Grant hesitated. This was Doyle, the commander he had trusted more than any leader he had ever served under. The man who vanished during the operation that shattered their unit. The man the military eventually declared dead. Grant slid the cassette into the recorder and pressed play. Static crackled through the chamber. Then Doyle's voice emerged. Faint but unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. I should have told you the truth sooner." Grant froze. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. The mission wasn't compromised by accident. Someone inside our own chain fed intelligence to the wrong people. Someone wearing the same uniform we trusted. Someone we followed into fire. Grant's throat tightened. I tracked the leak. I followed it all the way to Pine Ridge, but I wasn't the only one who knew. The traitor found me first. Grant leaned closer, jaw clenched. Doyle coughed on the recording, a raw, painful sound. "If they find this bunker, they'll wipe it clean. They'll erase me. They'll erase the truth. But if you're still alive, Grant, you were always the one I trusted." Grant stopped breathing. Then Doyle's final words came through the speaker, quiet as a dying flame. "The traitor is still alive." The tape clicked off. Silence flooded the chamber. Grant stood motionless, as grief, anger, betrayal, and disbelief collided inside him. For an instant, he was back on that ridge overseas, hearing the explosion and watching men fall. Only this time, the enemy was not half a world away. The danger had followed him home. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Ears pointed toward the metal door that led deeper into the facility. A faint sound drifted through. Something distant, metallic. Like a stitch being pulled through old steel. Grant whipped around. Someone else was down here. He grabbed the flashlight and scanned the chamber walls until the beam landed on a second door, one he hadn't noticed before. A thin seam of light glowed beneath it. Pulsing slowly, Shadow growled again, stepping protectively in front of Grant. Grant shook his head. "No. We're not opening that. Not yet." He moved toward the stairwell instead. Up. Out. Regroup. That was instinct. That was survival. But when he reached the stairwell, he paused. Light. A faint glow shimmering along the opening above. Grant's blood ran cold. Someone was inside the tiny house. He turned to Shadow. "Stay behind me." Shadow didn't move an inch. He stood right at Grant's side. Grant climbed slowly, head rising above the floorboard level just enough to see. Feet. Boots. Modern military-style soles. Dusty. Silent. Standing inside his house. Whoever it was moved quietly, scanning the room, studying the walls, the corners, the seams. Looking for the opening. Grant ducked back down before the intruder could turn toward the hatch. Shadow pressed close. Muscles tight. Ready to spring. Grant leaned his forehead against the cold handrail, forcing himself to breathe. His mind raced as memories merged. The ambush, the explosion, Doyle's disappearance, the betrayal, someone from his past, someone who wasn't supposed to be alive, someone inside his home right now. Grant whispered. We wait. Shadow's gaze never left the opening. Above them, the intruder's boots shifted, turned, paused at the center of the tiny house. A slow exhale drifted through the cracks. Then, silence. After a long, tense minute, the footsteps moved toward the door. The latch clicked open. The intruder stepped outside. The door closed. Grant waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then he slumped against the wall beside the stairwell. Trembling with adrenaline, Shadow licked his hand softly, grounding him, bringing him back, whichever enemy Grant had faced overseas. He hadn't stayed overseas. He'd followed him home. And Doyle's final whisper echoed through Grant's mind like a warning from beyond the grave. The traitor is still alive. Grant closed his eyes. And for the first time, he knew this bunker wasn't just a hidden room. It was a graveyard of old secrets. And now that he'd opened it, now that Shadow had found it, the past wasn't done with him, not even close. Grant did not move for several long seconds. He gripped the stair rail, listening for any sign that the intruder had doubled back. The tiny house above him, his supposed sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell around a trap. Shadow stayed beside him, gaze locked on the opening. Grant let the cold air steady his breathing. "We go up quiet," he murmured. He climbed first and raised the hidden panel an inch at a time. Dusty air drifted down from the room above. No boots, no shadows. Nothing but wind brushing the pines outside. Grant stepped into the cabin, Shadow close behind. He slid the panel shut and swept dust back across the seams until the floor looked untouched. Then he listened again. The porch was silent. Whoever had entered the house was gone for now. Grant rubbed both hands over his face. "We'll figure this out," he whispered to Shadow. "But we keep that room sealed." As he paced, his eyes caught something near the broken edge of the doorway. 2 faint muddy prints, wide, heavy, deep at the heel. Shadow sniffed them and growled. Grant crouched. The tread was not the worn pattern of a neighbor's work boot. It was the aggressive, blocky sole common on tactical footwear, familiar enough to tighten something in his chest. "I know," he whispered. He crossed to the only window and lifted the curtain a fraction. Across the road, Megan Pierce stood on her porch with a laundry basket in her arms. She was not looking at the clothes. She was staring at Grant's house. More precisely, she was staring at a thin wash of light escaping through a warped seam near the floor. Grant stepped back too late. "Grant," Megan called, "is everything okay in there?" Shadow barked once. Grant opened the door only a few inches. "Everything's fine, Megan. Just a long night." Megan set the basket down. "I saw a light under the house. Do you have a generator down there or something?" Her tone carried curiosity, not accusation. But in a small town, curiosity traveled faster than weather. "Just repairs," Grant said. "Nothing to worry about." Porch lights flicked on one by one along the road. Doors opened. Faces appeared. Megan glanced around, suddenly realizing how many people had heard her. "I just thought it looked like something was under his house." That was enough. Within minutes, neighbors gathered along the road in coats, robes, and work boots. Some held coffee mugs. Others held phones. Whispers passed from person to person until Earl Mathers appeared beside his truck with a grin already waiting on his face. "Well, look at that," Earl called. "I told you all the Marine was hiding something." Grant stiffened. Shadow growled. Earl came closer, hands in his pockets. "So what's down there, Holloway? Stolen gear? Something you brought home from the war?" "That's enough," Grant said. Earl lowered his voice. "Or maybe you're losing it again." Shadow surged forward. Grant caught the harness before the dog could reach Earl. Earl stumbled back, and several people gasped. Phones rose higher. Only Megan looked angry for a different reason. "He provoked him," she said. "You all saw that." Before anyone answered, Sheriff Boone's cruiser rolled around the corner without its lights on. Boone stepped out and surveyed the crowd. "What's going on?" Earl pointed toward Grant's cabin. "He's hiding something under the house." Boone's eyes settled on Grant. "Is that true, Holloway?" "Nothing illegal is happening here," Grant replied. "Everyone needs to go home." Boone rested one hand near his belt, not drawing, just reminding everyone of the badge. "Open the door. Let me take a look." Grant's pulse thudded in his ears. Shadow pressed against his leg. "No." Boone's expression hardened. "You want to rethink that? It's my property. You don't have a warrant." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Megan stepped into the road. "Leave him alone." Heads turned. "He's done nothing wrong," she said. "You don't get to treat him like a criminal, because people are curious." Boone looked at the phones recording him, then at the crowd. Whatever he wanted to do, he did not want to do it in front of witnesses. "We'll talk later," he said. The neighbors slowly drifted away. already carrying new versions of the story back to their porches. Megan remained. "Just be careful," she told Grant quietly. "People here don't handle secrets very well." Grant nodded. After her door closed across the street, he locked his own and knelt beside Shadow. "It's starting, boy," he whispered. "Doyle warned us, and now everybody's watching." The faint light from below finally disappeared when Grant killed the bunker power. Darkness returned to the seams of the floor. The secret had slept for years. Shadow had found it. Grant had opened it. And now, someone else knew enough to come looking. Grant barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust against the siding, every crunch of gravel tightened his chest. Shadow remained near the door like a sentry, ears moving at the smallest sound. Just after 3 in the morning, Grant finally drifted off in the old armchair. Shadow's sudden growl snapped him awake. Grant sat upright. "What is it, boy?" The dog stood rigid, body angled toward the door. Then Grant heard it, the faint scrape of a boot outside. Someone was back. Instinct took over. Grant motioned Shadow behind him and moved toward the window. Before he reached it, the porch boards groaned under a heavy step. The doorknob turned slowly, carefully. Far too carefully for a drunk neighbor. This was someone trained. Grant moved toward the door. "Shadow, stay." Shadow ignored the command. The door crashed inward. A tall figure in dark tactical gear burst through the frame, sending splinters across the floor. Shadow launched himself at the intruder before Grant could reach him. The man reacted with frightening speed. He twisted, drove an armored knee into Shadow's ribs, and knocked the dog sideways. Shadow yelped and hit the floor hard. "Shadow!" The sound tore something open inside Grant. For half a second, the room blurred into desert dust, radio static, and the faces of men he had failed to bring home. Then Shadow struggled for breath, and the past vanished. Grant charged. The intruder swung first. Grant slipped the strike and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, smashing him into the broken doorframe. The masked figure shoved him away with practiced force, recovered his footing, and retreated. Not panicked, calculated. Grant reached the doorway just in time to see the man disappear into the tree line. He did not follow. Shadow mattered more. Grant dropped beside him. "Easy, boy. I'm here." The dog whimpered. His breathing was shallow, but there was no visible bleeding. Grant's hands shook as he lifted him. "You saved me again," he whispered. "Now it's my turn." Lights came on across the road. Doors opened. Earl shouted something from his porch, but Grant ignored every voice. He carried Shadow to his truck and drove through the dark toward the nearest 24-hour veterinary clinic in the next town. The veterinarian found severe bruising along Shadow's ribs, but no fracture and no internal bleeding. Grant sat on the floor beside the examination table while the dog was treated, one hand resting against his shoulder. By the time they returned to Pine Ridge, the eastern sky had begun to pale. Shadow was sore, wrapped, and under strict orders to rest. Grant settled him on a blanket beside the heater. "I'm not leaving you," he said. Shadow closed his eyes. Grant stayed there until the dog's breathing became slow and even. Only then did he look at the ruined door. The break-in was not random. The intruder had moved with the same economy Grant had seen in trained operators. Controlled footwork. No wasted motion. Tactical boots. Deliberate retreat. And Doyle's warning waited beneath the floor. Grant hated the idea of leaving Shadow even for a minute, so he dragged the old armchair beside the hidden panel, placed water within the dog's reach, and opened the access only after Shadow was fully settled. "I'll be right below you," he whispered. He descended into the bunker. This time he did not wander. He went straight to the desk and the tapes. The next cassette was labeled Haven 6 Part 2. Grant pressed play. Doyle's voice emerged through the static. "If you found the first tape, then the danger is closer than you think. They knew I was onto them. And if you're hearing this, they know you're onto them too." Grant leaned closer. The traitor was protected, respected, someone people trusted, someone with access. A pause. Then Doyle's voice dropped. "But I got a name before they found me." Grant stopped breathing. "Boone." The recorder hissed softly. "Sheriff Boone is the one who betrayed us. He's the one who'll come for the truth. He'll bury anyone who finds it." Grant sat motionless. Sheriff Boone. The man who had demanded access to the house. The man who had treated Grant like a threat from the moment he arrived. the man the entire town trusted. The truth finally had a face, and that face wore a badge. Grant looked up toward the ceiling, toward Shadow resting above him. No more hiding. No more running. No more letting the past hunt him in silence. If Boone wanted Doyle's truth buried, Grant was going to make sure the town saw it first. Grant stood in the cold metal chamber, the old recorder still humming faintly on the desk. Shadow's pained breathing drifted from the floor above like a reminder of everything at stake. The air down here felt different now, heavier, charged, almost humming with the weight of what Doyle left behind. Grant steadied himself and turned toward the row of steel filing cabinets lining the far wall. He'd skimmed them before, thinking they held nothing more than dusty records and old maps. But with Doyle's final confession ringing in his ears, he knew he had missed something big. He pulled the first drawer open. It groaned like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside were folders, thick and neatly arranged, all stamped with the same designation, Haven 6 Project, Confidential. Grant swallowed. He grabbed the top file and flipped it open. Inside were grainy surveillance photographs from overseas operations, with dates he recognized and locations he remembered from the worst days of deployment. He saw his own unit in the photos, men he'd fought beside, men he'd seen fall, men whose deaths were blamed on bad intel and miscommunication. But the papers attached to the photographs told a different story. The failures were deliberate. The attacks were coordinated, and someone fed the enemy every move they made. Grant's jaw tightened until it hurt. He kept digging. The second file contained maps of Montana, marked with circles and notes, detailing the movement of someone hiding in the mountains. Doyle's handwriting was everywhere, sharp, rushed, almost frantic. He was tracking Boone, Grant whispered. The third file was different, thicker, bound, heavy. He opened it and froze. Inside was a detailed account of the final mission Doyle ever led, the events that killed half their unit, the moments Grant relived every night in his nightmares. But this report gave context he never had. Timelines, intercepted communications, warnings Doyle filed that were ignored. Grant's throat tightened when he reached the last page. A signature. Sheriff Boone's signature, from years ago, back when Boone still wore a military uniform. Above the words, Intel verified. Proceed as ordered. Grant staggered back, breath hitched. Boone wasn't just involved, he authorized the operation. Grant pressed a hand to his forehead, forcing himself to keep reading despite the way his vision shook. The report continued. Intel compromised. Suspected internal leak. Trail suggests involvement from senior officer. No support requested. Danger level, critical. Then Doyle's own handwritten note at the bottom. I think I know who. If I disappear, follow the radios. Radios. Grant's gaze snapped to the far corner of the chamber. Beside the metal bunk sat an old military communication unit, dusty but intact. A tangle of cables connected it to a wall-mounted receiver panel. Grant approached slowly. He turned the power knob. A weak buzz filled the chamber, followed by static and broken beeps. The machine was still alive. Grant adjusted the dial. A frequency flickered awake, distorted, buried under layers of interference. But beneath the noise was something real. A coded transmission Doyle must have been tracking. It repeated every 30 seconds, like a heartbeat. Shadow whimpered upstairs, pulling Grant back from the radio. He killed the power, closed the file, and climbed the metal steps. Shadow's eyes opened when he reached him. Grant stroked the dog's head gently. I'm here, buddy, he murmured. I'm not going anywhere. Shadow nuzzled his hand. Even hurt, he still wanted to reassure Grant. Grant sat beside him, head resting against the wall. Doyle didn't just find a bunker, he whispered. He left the truth, all of it. The room felt impossibly small. Snow dusted the windows. The front door, splintered from the break-in, hung crooked on its hinges. Grant checked outside through the gap. The street was quiet. Too quiet. No late-night wanderers. No cars. Not even Earl shouting insults from his porch. Pine Ridge had a way of going still when danger moved through it. Grant returned to Shadow and gently lifted him. I'm not losing you, he said. Not again. Not to them. Shadow licked his chin weakly. Grant carried him to the bed, and wrapped him carefully in the old quilt. He watched the dog's breathing even out as the warmth seeped in. Then he grabbed the folder labeled Haven 6, tucked it under his arm, and descended into the bunker again. There was one last drawer he hadn't opened, the bottom one, the one with the reinforced lock. Grant knelt and examined it. The lock wasn't damaged, just old. He forced a screwdriver into the metal seam and pried with all his strength. The lock snapped. Inside was a single object, a small, sealed metal box. Grant's pulse quickened. He lifted it with both hands and placed it on the desk. The lid resisted, stuck for a moment, then popped open with a metallic hiss. Inside lay a worn leather notebook, Captain Doyle's journal. Grant's breath caught as he carefully opened the first page. If you found this, you know the truth, and you know Boone won't stop. This is everything. What happened, why it happened, and how to finish what I started. Grant turned the next page. It held names, dates, encrypted codes, details of the traitors' involvement spanning years, far beyond their unit. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a cover-up, a network, an entire operation Doyle uncovered alone. Grant closed the journal slowly, hands shaking. He felt sick, not from fear, but from the realization of how deep this went. Boone wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was part of something far bigger. Grant stood up. His reflection in the steel wall looked different. Harder, older, carved by years of grief, and now by this new purpose. He climbed back into the house, sat beside Shadow again, and whispered, "We're not running anymore." Shadow opened his eyes. "We're taking this to the town," Grant said. "To the people. To anyone who will listen. Doyle's not dying in the dark." A wind gust shook the shattered door. Grant stared into the night, jaw clenched. Boone wanted the past buried, but Grant Holloway, Marine survivor, and the only man left who still owed Doyle a debt, he was going to dig it up, and this time, he wasn't alone. Shadow lifted his head and rested it against Grant's leg. The tiny house, once a joke in Pine Ridge, glowed faintly with purpose. For the first time, Grant saw it clearly. This wasn't a $1 mistake, it was a calling. Grant felt it in his chest the moment he stepped outside with Doyle's journal tucked beneath his arm. The morning air was razor cold, sharp enough to sting his lungs, but he welcomed the burn. It kept him grounded. Shadow walked at his side, slow, stiff, but unwilling to be left behind. His ribs were wrapped, his limp pronounced. Yet determination burned in his eyes. Grant told him to stay home. Shadow refused. The two moved down the snowy, cracked road toward Pine Ridge's center. The sun was barely up, but the town was already awake. Curtains shifted, doors opened, whispered voices followed them like drifting smoke. "Is that the veteran? Heard there was a break-in. Dog looks hurt. Maybe he lost it again." Grant didn't stop, didn't look at them. Every step took him closer to the sheriff's office, closer to the man who'd betrayed him long before Grant ever stepped foot back into Pine Ridge. The bell jingled sharply when Grant pushed open the diner door. Conversations died instantly. Every eye turned toward him as he walked to the counter and laid Captain Doyle's journal flat on the wood. The owner, Carla, blinked at it, unsure. "Grant, what's going on?" He flipped open the book. "This," he said, "is what's been hidden under that tiny house for decades. And this," he tapped the signature page, "is Sheriff Boone's handwriting." Gasps. A fork clattered to the floor. Old Mrs. Kent stood up, hand trembling. "That can't be. Boone's been sheriff here for 20 years. Grant looked her in the eye. "And he's been lying for 20 years. Murmurs swelled through the room. Earl Mathers stood from his corner booth, face red. "You really think people are going to believe you?" Earl scoffed. "You're a drifter with a busted dog and a broken mind. Boone served this town. You served trouble." Shadow stepped forward, a low, warning rumble slipping from his throat. Grant didn't flinch. "Doyle was my commander. He left a record of everything Boone did overseas, everything he covered up here. Boone had soldiers killed, Earl. Men I fought beside." Someone whispered, "Is this real?" Someone else murmured, "Those records look real." Grant lifted the journal for all to see. "If you want the truth, meet me in the square at noon. I'll show every page, every recording, no more hiding." And with that, he walked out. By noon, Pine Ridge had gathered, dozens forming a half-circle around the old memorial in the center of town. Grant stood before them with Shadow lying at his feet, the journal and tapes stacked neatly on the stone bench beside him. Megan Pierce arrived first, her breath fogging in the cold air. She stepped close and whispered, "Do you want me to record this?" "Whatever happens, people should hear it." Grant nodded. Then Sheriff Boone arrived. His cruiser rolled up slow, dust kicking around the tires. He stepped out with his hat pulled low, badge glinting in the pale sunlight. He tried to smile politely, but the edges were tight, forced. "What's all this?" Boone asked casually, though his eyes flicked straight to the journal. Grant opened it. "Doyle recorded everything," he said plainly. "You didn't just feed intel to the wrong people. You authorized it. You signed off on the mission that killed half our unit. And when Doyle found you out, you silenced him. Locked his truth under a house no one wanted." The crowd erupted. Shocked whispers, gasps, accusations. Boone raised his hands. "Now, wait just a minute. This man has PTSD. He's confused." Grant pressed play on Doyle's final recording. Doyle's voice filled the square, shaky, but unmistakable. "If you found this, then Boone's still out there. He'll come for you, just like he came for me." Boone lunged forward. "Turn that off." Shadow leapt to his feet, teeth bared. Grant stepped between them. "Don't," he warned. But Boone wasn't listening. His hand shot toward Grant's coat in a frantic attempt to seize the cassette, as if tearing it away could undo the past. Megan raised her phone. "I photographed the pages this morning and sent them to the FBI field office. They already called me back." Boone froze. At the far end of the street, a black SUV turned into the square. 2 federal agents stepped out, flashing credentials. "Sheriff Boone, we need you to step back and keep your hands visible." Boone's face drained of color. The agents moved forward. The crowd parted. Shadow growled low as Boone took a step backward. "This is a mistake," Boone said, voice cracking. "He doesn't know what he found." Grant pulled the journal tight to his chest. "I know exactly what I found," he said. "And I know exactly who you are." Boone's shoulders sagged. The agents secured Boone in handcuffs and guided him toward the SUV. The old sheriff looked around at the town he'd controlled for decades. People who now stared at him not with respect, but with betrayal and horror. As they loaded him in, Boone's gaze met Grant's. "You should have left it buried," he whispered. Grant shook his head. "That's what cowards do." The door shut. Silence washed over Pine Ridge. Then slowly, one by one, people stepped closer to Grant. Carla from the diner, Mrs. Kent, Earl, red-faced and speechless. Megan, recorder still running. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, grief, and guilt. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Kent whispered. "We all thought. Well, we thought you were broken." Grant looked down at Shadow, who nudged his leg gently. "I was," Grant said softly, "but he wasn't." The dog looked up, eyes steady, loyal, unbroken. Someone began to clap. Someone else joined, and then the whole square echoed with applause. A sound Grant hadn't heard directed at him in years. A sound that felt like something inside him finally easing, finally breathing. Grant placed a hand on Shadow's back. "We're not done," he murmured, "but we're getting there." For the first time, Pine Ridge looked at him not as the man who bought a $1 shack, but as someone who had brought the truth back from the dead. In the days that followed Boone's arrest, the town felt different, lighter, quieter, as if the mountains themselves exhaled after holding their breath for far too long. Word spread fast. The FBI combed through the bunker, confirmed the recordings, and secured every document Doyle had left behind. Pine Ridge watched their once trusted sheriff driven away in a convoy of black vehicles. And the silence he left behind seemed to echo through every snowy street. But for Grant Holloway, nothing echoed louder than the soft, pained breathing of Shadow. The dog was healing, but slowly. His ribs were bruised deep, his movements stiff and careful. Yet no matter how much Grant begged him to rest, Shadow followed him everywhere. Tail slow, steps cautious, but refusing to let Grant walk alone. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the frozen yard, Grant knelt beside him. "You don't have to guard me now," he whispered, brushing Shadow's fur. "It's over." Shadow looked up with eyes that said he disagreed, that he'd keep guarding until his last breath. Grant smiled, the first real smile he'd allowed himself in years. "All right," he murmured. "Then we build something worth guarding." Over the next week, townsfolk began showing up at Grant's tiny house, at first cautiously, then more boldly. Mrs. Kent brought food. Megan dropped off spare blankets and tools. Earl, too proud to say the word sorry, left a box of new hinges on the porch and walked away without knocking. Grant used them to rebuild the damaged door. The FBI had cleared the bunker, leaving behind only the empty metal room and the heavy silence Doyle once lived with. Grant stood inside the chamber one evening, Shadow at his side, running his fingers over the cold steel walls. This was no longer a hiding place. It deserved to become something more. Shadow nudged him gently, as if urging him forward. Grant nodded. The next morning he hammered a wooden sign beside the house. Hand-painted, the letters uneven but clear. Avon House, in honor of Captain Elias Doyle. Below it, a place for veterans who need a warm bed, a warm meal, or someone to listen. The first person to step forward was a quiet man named Frank Brewer, a Vietnam vet who'd lived on the outskirts of Pine Ridge for decades. He walked up the driveway slowly, hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn jacket. "You really mean it?" Frank asked. "Anyone can come?" Grant extended his hand. "Anyone who served. Anyone who's hurting. Anyone who needs a place." Frank's eyes watered as he shook Grant's hand. Within days, others came. 2 former Army engineers passing through town, a widowed Air Force mechanic, a Marine still haunted by his last tour. Grant opened the hatch to the bunker, showing them the renovated interior, fresh lights, clean cots, stocked shelves, blankets folded neatly in rows. The cold metal chamber was slowly transforming into a sanctuary. And every veteran who stepped inside placed a hand on the wall and whispered Doyle's name in respect. Shadow supervised each visitor with calm, watchful eyes, limp and all, earning gentle pats and whispered thanks from men who understood better than most the value of a loyal companion. One evening, as orange dusk settled over Pine Ridge, Megan arrived with a camera. Shadow trotted over to greet her, tail wagging with a careful sway. "Grant," she said, "people online are talking about what happened here. Some want to help. Some want to tell Doyle's story, so others won't be forgotten." Grant leaned against the railing of his repaired porch. "I don't want fame. I don't want glory." "I know," Megan replied softly, "but maybe this place can help more than just Pine Ridge." Grant looked at the tiny house, the peeling paint, the crooked roofline, the stubborn little window that always stuck halfway open. He looked at the wooden sign, at Shadow sitting proudly on the porch, chest lifted as if announcing that this was his post, and he would defend it forever. He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said, "let's tell the story." Doyle earned that. Megan smiled, lifting the camera. "Start wherever you want." Grant rested a hand on Shadow's head. "I'll start with him," he said. "This dog didn't just find a secret. He saved my life over and over again. And when I had nothing, he led me to the one thing that brought everything back." He paused, eyes softening. "A purpose." That night, after Megan left, Grant sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. Snowflakes drifted gently through the cold air. The lights glowing inside the bunker cast a warm halo beneath the tiny house. Grant scratched behind Shadow's ear. "You know," he murmured, "I thought that $1 house was a joke, a curse, maybe even a mistake." Shadow leaned his head against Grant's knee. "But it wasn't any of those things," Grant whispered. "It was Doyle guiding me home. It was you dragging me forward when I was ready to give up." He looked out over Pine Ridge, the mountains rising dark against the twilight sky, the quiet town settling into calm. "This little house saved me," he said softly. "And now, it's going to save others." Shadow closed his eyes, content. Grant took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he didn't feel haunted. He felt whole. In the stillness of the Montana evening, Grant Holloway placed a hand on his dog's back and whispered, $1 bought me a roof, but you and Doyle gave me a life." Shadow thumped his tail. The light from the bunker glowed brighter. And Haven House, once a forgotten shelter buried beneath a broken shack, was reborn as a place of warmth, truth, and healing, a place where darkness finally surrendered to hope. Before you go, tell me this. If you were standing with Grant and Shadow on that porch tonight, would you choose hope or silence? Type 1 for hope or 0 for silence in the comments. And if this story touched you, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. We've got more powerful, emotional, veteran, and dog stories coming your way. Stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances you won't want to miss.